The British government bought a remote Scottish island in 1942, tested anthrax on it, and left it so contaminated it stayed off limits for nearly 50 years. On a now abandoned island in the Aral Sea, Soviet scientists ran the world's biggest bioweapons lab. Things went historically wrong. Visitors still have to wear full hazmat suits just to step foot on it. And in Kazakhstan, the Soviets built a secret city next to their main nuclear test site where they detonated 456 bombs. And now the surrounding villages are mostly empty. These are real towns used for government experiments that are now abandoned. Back in 1942, the British government quietly bought Grenard Island off the coast of Scotland and turned it into a biological weapons testing site. The mission was to see if anthrax could be weaponized. Scientists from Porton Down, Britain's secretive chemical warfare lab, loaded explosives with anthrax spores and dropped them on the island, wiping out flocks of sheep. Well, the spores stuck around. Anthrax clings to soil for decades, and Grenard was so contaminated that the government sealed it off for nearly 50 years. It was often referred to as Anthrax Island. Nobody lived there after the test, and for decades there were warning signs everywhere. But then in 1986, the British government finally tried to clean it up, spraying 280 tons of formaldehyde and digging out the worst of the topsoil. In 1990, a junior defense minister even went on TV, picking up a handful of dirt to prove that it was safe again. But nobody was all that enthusiastic about coming back to the place, and the island is still empty to this day. Kulagina was a tiny Soviet town in Vozrozhdenia Island in what's now Uzbekistan. About 1,500 people lived there. They were mostly scientists and their families who worked at Aralsk 7, a massive biological weapons lab in the middle of the island. This place wasn't just big, it was the biggest bioweapons testing site on the planet during the Cold War. But for all that size, the safety standards were a total joke. In 1971, a smallpox test went wrong, 10 people got infected, 3 died, and it almost caused a global outbreak. That alone should have been enough to shut it all down, but it didn't. A year later, 2 fishermen were found dead. They'd been exposed to the bubonic plague, again from the lab, and then a whole bunch of animals started dying off. Fishermen were pulling up nets of dead fish. Not long after, 50,000 antelopes suddenly dropped dead. Meanwhile, Kulagina was being used to dump anthrax waste. The lab was finally shut down in 1991, after the Soviet Union fell. And then in 2002, the US stepped in and helped fund a cleanup to help whatever was left on the island from falling into the wrong hands. Even after all that cleaning though, this island is still very dangerous. Only a few expeditions have been allowed since then, and anyone going in wears full hazmat gear and takes antibiotics just in case. In northeast Kazakhstan, there's a test site called Semipalatinsk, better known as the Polygon. It was the Soviet Union's main nuclear testing zone from 1949 to 1989. And over those 40 years, the Soviets detonated 456 nuclear explosives here. Some were in the air, others were underground. The first Soviet atomic bomb, codenamed First Lightning, was tested here in 1949. The explosions were so massive they left deep craters and cracked the earth open for miles. And at the center of it all, though, was a town, Kurchatov, built to house scientists, engineers, and military workers. It was a secret city, totally off limits to outsiders. But the thing is, nearby villages were often exposed to radiation as well. Locals weren't told what was happening, they just got sick. Hair loss, birth defects, cancer. Some estimates say around 1.5 million people were affected. After the USSR collapsed in 1991, the site was shut down and Kurchatov started to empty out. Today, most of the surrounding area is abandoned. In the late 50s, the US Army decided that it would be a good idea to build a full-on underground base in the middle of the Greenland ice sheet. They called it Camp Century. On paper, it was just a research station to test how people could survive in extreme cold. But in reality, it was part of something called Project Iceworm, which was a secret plan to hide hundreds of nuclear missiles under the ice, aimed at the Soviet Union. They built 21 tunnels into the glacier, added sleeping quarters, a kitchen, there was even a movie theater, and they powered it all with a portable nuclear reactor. But the plan didn't last. It turns out glaciers have a tendency to move, So the ice started shifting and crushing the tunnels, the reactor had to be removed, and by 1967 the camp was shut down and left behind. Most of it is still buried under the ice, along with leftover fuel, chemicals, and some radioactive waste. When they built it, they figured it would stay frozen forever, but now that ice is starting to melt. So yeah, there's a half-buried nuclear base under Greenland, and nobody's totally sure what kind of mess is sitting under there.
We have Harlow's Pit of Despair. You know that book, If You Give a Mouse a Cookie? It's kind of like that, but instead of giving a mouse a cookie, you take a monkey's mom away. I guess it's not really the same thing. Anyways, the experiment took place in the 1960s, and it was designed to better understand the effects of attachment on the development of young minds. In the experiment, infant monkeys were separated from their real mothers and were instead raised by wire mothers made of, well, wire, and cloth mothers made of cloth. The wire monkey had food and the cloth monkey was warm. The infantile monkeys, the real ones that were alive, always went for the cloth mother every time, except for, of course, mealtime, and that was the only time they ever went to the wire mother, was for food. In some variations of the experiment, the monkeys were placed in an isolation chamber for anywhere from a few days to as long as 10 weeks. Almost immediately, the monkeys would begin huddling in the corner and would remain motionless for the majority of their stay in the chambers. The monkeys in the experiment became so incapable of interacting with other monkeys that when it came time to mate, scientists would strap the affected monkeys down to a rack and have an unaffected monkey, you know. Anyways, the female monkeys who gave birth were unable to care for their young due to the extreme psychological torment they'd experienced throughout their lives. You might have heard of this in school, but I bet they didn't tell you all that. Or maybe they did. I only took
2015, scientists at the Laser Interferometer Gravitational Wave Observatory, or LIGO, basically did the impossible. They caught a ripple in space itself. Two black holes had smashed into each other over 1 billion years ago, and that crash sent out gravitational waves, like shock waves, through the universe. We'd heard this was possible. Einstein said it was back in 1915, but no one had actually ever seen it happen. The Laser Interferometer Gravitational Wave Observatory is made up of two giant tunnels, each over 2.5 miles long, filled with lasers, built to measure movements smaller than a single atom. What LIGO, or LIGO, detected was so small, it's insane. It would be like noticing your car move 1/1,000,000th of a hair's width, but that tiny wobble proved something massive, that space-time isn't fixed. It stretches, it vibrates, moves. Next up, I'm going to talk a bit about muons, which are subatomic particles similar to electrons but over 200 times heavier, and they can pass through solid objects like rock or steel with ease. Scientists at Fermilab near Chicago have this massive 50-foot wide magnet ring. They've been flinging muons through it to watch how they behave. Now that sounds weird, but it's important, because if the movement of the muons doesn't match what our physics books say it should, well, something's off. And turns out it is. The way they move seems to show there might be an invisible force or unknown particle interfering with them, something we haven't accounted for in the standard model of physics, which is basically our best blueprint for how the universe works at the smallest level. In 2021 and again in 2023, researchers got results that strongly hinted something strange really is going on. They're still trying to confirm it, but if the anomaly holds up, it could mean one of two things. Either there's a flaw in our current model of physics, or there's something out there we haven't discovered yet. Either way, it'd be one of the biggest shakeups in science for decades. In 1963, the US military dumped 480 million copper needles into Earth's orbit. They wanted to build a backup communication system in case the Soviets ever knocked out global radio during the Cold War. So these tiny needles, each one about 1.8 centimeters long, were meant to act like little antennas floating in space. So if radio signals couldn't bounce off the ionosphere or satellites were down, they'd bounce off this artificial belt instead. The idea came from Lincoln Labs at MIT. It was launched under a program called Project Needles, later renamed Project West Ford. They figured that by placing these needles into a circular orbit above Earth, they could make a crude but reliable way to keep communication alive in a worst-case scenario. Well, when the needles were deployed, they didn't exactly form the tidy rings scientists were hoping for. Most of them clumped together, and radio signal testing was underwhelming. The project was eventually shelved, but not before astronomers lost their minds over it. A lot of them saw it as just littering space with metal debris, and it set off this wave of protest from scientists around the world. Even though it didn't work out, West Forward did show how far governments were willing to go during the Cold War, to the point of turning Earth into a giant radio antenna. The US government has been pouring money into quantum teleportation since the early 2000s. Now, what is quantum teleportation though? Well, this involves transferring information from one place to another instantly, without anything physically moving in between. It works by using something called quantum entanglement. That's when two tiny particles become linked, but not physically linked. See, the funny thing is, once this link happens, if you change one particle, the other reacts instantly, no matter how far apart they actually are. Einstein called this spooky action at a distance. 2004, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, or DARPA, which is the Pentagon's research arm, they helped set up a working quantum teleportation network in Boston. It connected Harvard, Boston University, and a tech firm called BBN. Basically, they used this entanglement trick to send ultra-secure messages. If anyone tried to intercept the message, the entanglement would break, and the system would know right away. That's also what makes this so crazy. It's not just fast, it's almost unhackable. You can't read the message without leaving fingerprints. The experiment proved that it could work in real-world conditions, not just labs. The technology is still in its early stages, but if this scales up, it could totally change how we communicate across large distances. Scientists found some very odd results in a test that could completely change our model of physics. So in 2022, scientists at Fermilab, a massive government-funded particle lab near Chicago, announced they'd been studying this tiny thing called the W boson. And their measurements said it was heavier than it was supposed to be. But first of all, what is a W boson? Well, it's a tiny particle that helps certain types of nuclear decay happen. It basically carries one of the fundamental forces of nature, the weak nuclear force, which is what makes radioactive stuff break down. According to our best theory of how the universe works, called the Stanford model, we can predict the W boson's mass almost exactly. But when the Fermilab team measured it, they found it was heavier than the theory said it should be. Not just by a little, by quite a large margin. If their result is correct, it means there's something wrong with the current model of physics. Something is either missing, or we're just not getting something. And then in 2023 and 2024, scientists at the Large Hadron Collider in Europe tried to measure the same thing. Their results were totally normal though. So now you've got two of the world's biggest physics labs arguing over whether one of the building blocks of reality is wrong. They technically weren't arguing, but they were surprised by the results. Either Fermilab's equipment was off, or we just found the crack that could lead to a brand new kind of physics. In the mid-90s, a Russian scientist named Eugene Podlaknov claimed he'd found a way to partially block gravity. His setup involved a spinning disc made from a superconducting material, a kind of super cold ceramic that lets electricity flow without resistance. When this disc spun at high speed, inside a magnetic field, Podlaknov said objects placed above it weighed up to 2% less. That might not sound like much, but if this was true, it meant he'd found a way to reduce gravity itself, which completely goes against what Isaac Newton and Einstein told us. The claim made enough noise that NASA actually took it seriously. They tried to replicate the experiment, never got the exact same results. But if he was right, it would mean we could manipulate gravity, which opens the door to things like gravity shields or new ways to power spacecraft. In the early 2000s, the US Air Force started working on something called the Marauder project. This was a secret program focused on creating a plasma railgun, a weapon that fires plasma projectiles at insanely high speeds, up to about 3% the speed of light. For context, light travels at roughly 186,000 miles per second, so 3% of that is still over 5,500 miles per second. That's not just fast, it's practically mind-blowing. Plasma is a super hot, charged gas, and controlling it in a weapon form means you're working with physics that go beyond what we normally see in everyday life. The Marauder aimed to launch donut-shaped plasma bolts that could destroy targets with extreme precision and power. This involved pushing electrical currents and magnetic fields to their absolute limits, crossing into the territory of near light speed physics. The exact details are classified, but Marauder showed how military research can test the edges of what physics says is possible. Back in the 50s, Canada launched something called Project Magnet, a government-funded study exploring whether magnetic fields could explain UFO flight. The idea was that if aliens were flying saucers, maybe their craft used magnetism to hover and zoom around, which would break our understanding of physics because it defies how planes and rockets work. Scientists and engineers in Project Magnet installed magnetometers, which are devices that measure magnetic fields, and they placed them at various spots across Canada to detect unusual magnetic activity that might hint at alien technology. They also investigated reports of strange blights and objects in the sky. The project was one of the first official government efforts to take UFOs and aliens seriously. Project Magnet didn't find any alien flying saucers or new physics breakthroughs, unfortunately, at least not officially, but it was ahead of its time in the idea that magnetism could be the key to future technology. Even today, research into magnetic propulsion is still a cutting-edge field. In 1989, two chemists, Martin Fleischmann and Stanley Pons, stood in front of the world and said they'd done something insane. They'd created nuclear fusion in a glass jar on a table. Now, fusion is what powers the sun. It's when atoms smash together so hard that they fuse, releasing a ton of energy. Normally, to make this happen, you need insane heat, millions of degrees, which obviously isn't something you pull off in a lab without a nuclear reactor. But these two guys claimed they found a shortcut. They said they'd gotten fusion to happen using a piece of metal called palladium, soaked in heavy water. That's water where the hydrogen atoms are heavier than normal. The way they told it, the palladium somehow packed the hydrogen atoms so tightly together they fused without the heat, without the radiation, without the giant facility. Scientists lost their minds. This was going to change the world. No more gas, no more oil, just endless cheap power from a bucket of water. When other scientists tried to copy the experiment, most of them couldn't get it to work. People started calling it junk science, but cold fusion never fully went away. Even now, private labs and startups are still trying to crack it. Starting in the early 90s, the US military and scientific agencies began operating HARP's High-Frequency Active Auroral Research Program in Alaska. HARP is basically a giant radio transmitter that blasts huge amounts of energy into the ionosphere, which is the layer of Earth's atmosphere filled with charged particles way above us. The official goal was to see how this layer reacts when hit with strong radio waves, which helps improve things like communication and GPS. Basically, HARP throws a rock into a pond. Those radio waves create little ripples in the ionosphere, which acts like Earth's invisible magnetic shield. Scientists watch how these ripples move and change to understand how the shield protects us from space weather. But sending that much energy into the sky doesn't go unnoticed, and folks quickly spun conspiracy theories claiming that HARP could control weather, cause earthquakes, or even mess with people's minds. None of those stories have ever been proven, but the science behind HARP is legit, and it's pretty cool. The project, officially shut down in 2014, was handed over to the University of Alaska, which still uses it for research. Alright, next up, we have the occultism practices of the SS during World War II. Not only does the man who shall not be named, whose name starts with H, not only did he win the award for history's most evil man, but he's also one of the weirdest as well. He took things to comic book levels of villainy, though, when he began having the Third Reich delve into the realm of the occult. Most of this was led by one of his right-hand men, Heinrich Himmler, who was very into occult stuff. They would seek out ancient artifacts that were believed to hold special powers. There were experiments done on psychokinesis. They'd perform dark rituals. One of the most famous locations they used for some of these rituals was Huska Castle in the Czech Republic, said to have been built over a bottomless pit to hell. Apparently, they'd attempt to summon up demonic powers to aid in their crusade. crusade. It's absolutely insane. It's like Indiana Jones. It's just, yeah.
Next on the list we have HARP. That's HAARP, the High Frequency Active Auroral Research Program that controls the weather. Maybe. The HARP uses powerful radio waves between 3 and 30 million hertz to heat ionospheric plasma. What is ionospheric plasma? Well, it's a mix of electrons, atomic and molecular ions, and neutral particles that exist within the ionosphere surrounding the Earth, which protects us from the sun's harmful UV rays and what can only be described as unpredictable space weather. With all that being said, I don't really think it's that far-fetched for people to believe that by manipulating and heating ionospheric plasma, the government is quite literally actively experimenting with it. Duh. Exploring the effects of changes to this layer in the Earth's atmosphere that directly relates to Earth temperature regulation, it's kinda weird. Is it getting hot in here, or is it just the government secretly experimenting? You tell me, but actually let me know in the comments because I do like to read them.
Alright, next on the list we have the Robert J. White experiments. Fair warning, things get kinda icky here, especially if you're an animal lover. For some reason in the 50s, 60s, and even into the 70s, there were a number of experiments done with animals that involved taking the head of one animal and then placing it on a different body, like Sid from Toy Story, and then seeing if the animal would live. This was done with dogs, frogs, monkeys, cats. Well, in 1970, the US government funded an experiment carried out by Robert J. White, where he transplanted the head of a monkey onto the body of another, and was actually successful. This new Franken monkey could hear, it could smell, it could taste, and it could even follow objects with its eyes for just over a week, and then it died.
Next up, we have that one time the United States government spent millions of taxpayer dollars trying to figure out the validity of psychic and paranormal phenomenon, which James has touched upon in 2 points already. But like, honestly, they could have saved a lot of money if they had just given James and I $500 each to spend a night on Poveglia Island, the most haunted island in Italy, and we could like telepathically tell them the ghosts that we saw. But that's another story. The main goal of the project was to determine whether or not a person could use psychic abilities to gather information about distant or hidden opposing operations. Many experiments were conducted to determine whether or not individuals were able to provide specific details regarding locations, objects, or events using only their minds. There are theories out there that claim that part of the experimentation involving paranormal research was geared towards psychic espionage, which again, James mentioned. Believe it or not, the project was ultimately considered a success, and while critics and skeptics continue to doubt the validity of psychic ability, it's actually not uncommon to see psychics working as valued members of the law, including CIA and FBI agents.
And finally, we have the secret experiments going on in Antarctica. Antarctica looks to be this mass of frozen wasteland, right? But for some reason, there are a number of government-run bases set up there, and while some of what goes on is disclosed to the public, there's other stuff that's a bit more mysterious. The United States and Russia are said to have set up secret research facilities in Antarctica to study alien technology and artifacts. These bases are equipped with advanced scientific equipment and are being run by elite scientists and military personnel. At least that's how the story goes. But some even claim that these facilities have made contact with extraterrestrials. So why Antarctica? Well, Antarctica is said to be a hotspot for UFOs, first of all. It does sound pretty far-fetched, but if aliens really were visiting Earth but wanted to stay out of sight, Antarctica would be a pretty prime spot. There are no permanent residents, and it's vast. So the idea of there being leftover alien technology buried under ice that scientists are researching or reverse engineering still sounds completely nuts, but you never really know, right? Do happen sometimes.
Yeah, and sometimes they turn out to be true. I mean, like, I want to think that the government has our best interest at heart, but sometimes I just don't know. Now, some of you may have seen the viral meme where a certain conspiracy theorist slams his hand on the table and loudly declares, "I'm sick of them putting chemicals in the water that turn the frickin' frogs gay." I'm not gonna say his name, but I'm sure many of you know who I'm talking about. Now, I know this man has said some incredibly offensive, insensitive, outlandish, and downright terrible things, but believe it or not, this particular theory might actually be true. Well, partly true that is. You see, in the early 2000s there was a study done that involved a pesticide by the name of atrazine. That's A-T-R-A-Z-I-N-E, because you just might want to know that information. The study also involved a group of African clawed frogs. Tadpoles raised in atrazine contaminated waters actually became hermaphrodites, developing both male and female reproductive organs. When adult male frogs were introduced into the waters, they stopped producing their male hormones and their reproductive organs became feminized. What's really scary is that the waters used in these experiments had atrazine levels as low as 0.1 parts per billion, which is 30 times lower than levels allowed in our drinking water. Atrazine is currently used in the United States, Canada, and Australia. Why? I have no clue. It really doesn't seem necessary or all that smart. Is this all some kind of strange government experiment? Maybe not, but also probably yes. It's like super weird, and also just like don't use it, but okay.
Next on the list we have the Nina Kulagina experiments. So Nina Kulagina was born in Russia in 1926, and from a very young age she started to notice that objects seemed to move on their own around her, especially when she was angry. She grew up realizing that she had psychokinetic abilities, which she claimed to have inherited from her mother. She joined the Red Army at 14 years old in the tank regiment during World War II. And then after the war, the Soviet government took notice of her strange abilities and began performing experiments with her. There is footage of her performing some of her psychic abilities, making small objects move on their own, apparently just with her mind. She was even said to have stopped a frog's heart from beating during one of these sessions. Now, did she truly have special abilities? Was she just a simple charlatan? Not 100% certain, but what is certain is that the USSR was very interested in her during the Cold War, and according to some, they even set out to see if she could take out enemies just by using her mind.
Next on our list we have Operation Red Hat, which involved accidentally releasing potentially harmful biological agents onto an unsuspecting public. The operation took place in 1971 and was conducted by a military testing facility in Utah. The purpose of the operation was to test various methods of disposal for chemical warfare agents. One of the methods involved burning the agents, including VX, which is an incredibly lethal nerve agent in open air pits. Yeah, you heard me. A room full of scientists, and no one thought to say maybe we shouldn't burn deadly chemicals in an open air pit. Okay. Of course it was an incredibly bad idea, as the act allegedly led to the release of a variety of toxic chemicals into the atmosphere that wafted into nearby civilian populations and very negatively affected them. It's assumed that a large number of people became incredibly ill and even died as a result of inhaling the air contaminated with the toxic agents, but I could have told you that. They need to think a little more.
It's not just Russia that took an interest in someone with supposed special abilities, but the USA as well. Yuri Geller is a much more well-known name than Nina Kulagina. This guy was kind of like the Chris Angel of the 70s, even appearing on talk shows like Johnny Carson. Geller is a self-proclaimed psychic and would also perform stuff like spoon bending. Now apparently there was also some less publicized stuff going on with him involving the CIA. This was the 70s, so the Cold War was still a thing. Not as tense as it had been in the 50s and 60s, but still present. So the CIA were very interested in the possibility of special abilities and if they'd be able to implement them into military operations. So they conducted a series of tests on Geller in 1973, focusing on his supposed clairvoyant abilities. In one of these experiments, scientists they did a test where they chose a random word from a dictionary while Geller was isolated in another room. He was supposed to draw what they'd picked without seeing or hearing them, of course. They picked the word fuse. Now, strangely, apparently when Geller came out of his isolated room, having no way of knowing what word they'd chosen, he had sketched a picture of a firecracker.
Next up, we have Operation Big Buzz, which took place in 1955, and once again involved exposing the public to incredibly dangerous biological agents. Yay! In this case, it was yellow fever along with some other highly contagious diseases. Over 30,000 infected mosquitoes were released throughout several southeastern United States. While the mosquitoes were supposedly not infected with live pathogens of the diseases, the experiment was still deemed highly unethical by the general public, who had received no warning of the operation before it took place. So, what was the point of the government releasing hundreds of thousands of mosquitoes carrying allegedly deadly viruses onto the general public? Well, many people believe it was a test run designed to see just how effective the infected mosquitoes were at transmitting the various viruses to humans in a range of different environmental conditions, presumably to test how mosquitoes would perform as vessels for biological warfare agents.
COINTELPRO, the FBI's covert surveillance program that ran from 1956 to 1971. This program was designed to keep an eye on civil rights groups and political organizations in the states. The FBI didn't just spy on these groups, they also tried to destroy them from the inside. Groups like the Black Panther Party and Martin Luther King Jr.'s Southern Christian Leadership Conference were targeted by this organization, along with the anti-Vietnam War activists. The FBI used every dirty trick in the book: wiretaps, forged letters, anonymous threats to sow distrust in the movements they were targeting. In one infamous incident, the FBI sent an anonymous letter to Martin Luther King Jr. in an attempt to blackmail him into taking his own life. Project Bluebird was one of the CIA's earlier attempts to figure out how to control minds and influence behavior. This program was the precursor to MKUltra, and it focused on using substances like LSD, hypnosis, and other psychological techniques to manipulate people. They wanted to create spies or assassins who could be controlled remotely without them even realizing it. Experimented on their own employees and even used soldiers and civilians as guinea pigs, all without telling them what was really going on. They tested things like sensory deprivation and sleep deprivation again to see how they could break someone's will and control their thoughts. It was, of course, a very shady program that relied heavily on the idea that people could be turned into mind-controlled agents. In the 60s and early 70s, the US Department of Defense had a plan to get rid of old, unwanted munitions. The operation was called Chase, which stands for Cut Holes and Sink 'em. As you can probably guess, the strategy was to load up decommissioned ships with outdated weapons and then sink them in the ocean. Most of the munitions were conventional weapons, like ammo and artillery, but a small portion of the shipments involved some very dangerous stuff like chemical weapons. The disposal sites were in the Atlantic Ocean, off the coast of Florida and the Bahamas, and in the Pacific Ocean as well. One of the biggest concerns at the time was the environmental impact and the possibility that the chemical weapons could leach into the ocean and contaminate it. As you can imagine, dumping toxic substances into the ocean isn't the best long-term solution. In 1964, a ship called Village was sunk with 7,348 tons of munitions. About 5 minutes after it went under, there were huge explosions. The blasts were so powerful that seismic equipment around the world picked them up. Now, luckily, this hadn't been a chemical weapons dump, but it showed just how dangerous this really was. By the late 60s, public awareness and concerns over dumping chemical weapons in the ocean was starting to grow. This culminated in the media coverage of the Chase 10 operation in 1970, where thousands of tons of chemical weapons were disposed of off the coast. But thankfully, in 1972, the US passed the Marine Protection, Research, and Sanctuaries Act, and a year later, the United Nations put out an international ban on dumping chemical weapons at sea. In the 40s and 50s, the US government tested atomic bombs in places places like Nevada and the Pacific Ocean. They didn't just test the bombs though, they also exposed people to the radiation from the tests. Soldiers were told to march toward ground zero right after the bomb went off, as if they were part of some military exercise, but these soldiers were exposed to radiation that would lead to all kinds of health problems down the line. Then there were the civilians. Thousands of people living near test sites were also unknowingly exposed to radiation, and to top it off, the government didn't tell anyone how dangerous the tests were, so people had no idea they were being exposed to deadly radiation. It wasn't until decades later that the full scope of these tests came out, but by then, the damage was already done. Finally, we have the US government's human radiation experiments, which took place mostly during the Cold War era. These experiments involved deliberately exposing American citizens to radiation, again, without their knowledge or consent, in order to study the effects of radiation exposure. The most infamous examples involved injecting people with radioactive material or having them swallow radioactive pills, all in the name of science. Many of the people involved in these experiments had no idea they were being tested on. Some were even pregnant women or underage themselves. Obviously, these experiments caused some severe long-term health issues for the victims. The US government didn't come clean about it until decades later. Alright, so let's dive into one of the most messed up programs the CIA ever ran, MKUltra. And if you don't know about it, prepare yourself because it's pretty wild. This program started in 1953 and ran all the way up to 1973. The CIA wanted to figure out ways to control people's minds, to turn them into perfect spies, and to manipulate them into doing whatever the government wanted. They experimented with hallucinogens and other illicit substances on unknowing people, basically trying to see if they could brainwash them. Most disturbingly, they didn't ask for consent. Some people didn't even know that they were part of an experiment. Imagine getting dosed with something without knowing and just watching your world slowly spiral out of control. The CIA also tried sensory deprivation, sleep deprivation, and other forms of manipulation to try and break the victims down. One of the more famous stories from MKUltra is Frank Olson, a CIA employee who was dosed with a hallucinogen without knowing it. A few days later, Olson fell from a hotel window and died. Officially, it was ruled that he'd taken his own life, but many think it had to do with the substances messing with his mind. Some even think that he'd been killed. Eventually, though, the whole MKUltra thing came to light, and people were horrified. The CIA destroyed most of the records, but what has been revealed paints a pretty disturbing picture of just how far the US government was willing to go in the name of research. Tuskegee syphilis study. If you haven't heard of it, you should. This is one of the darkest chapters in American medical history. It ran from 1932 all the way to 1972, and that is a very long time considering this whole thing was a massive violation of human rights. The US government and the Public Health Service decided to track the long-term effects of syphilis by studying a group of poor African American men living in Alabama. They didn't tell them that they had syphilis, and they didn't treat them for it either, even though penicillin had been discovered and was known to cure the disease by 1947. Instead of treating these men, they were told that they had something called the bad BLOOD and were just being observed for a study. They were kept in the dark while the researchers watched them get sicker and sicker. In fact, the researchers went out of their way to make sure the men didn't get treatment elsewhere. By the time the study was exposed, over 100 men had died from the disease, and many others suffered from severe complications, including blindness, paralysis, and heart problems. The people involved were treated like lab rats, denied basic treatment, and lied to for decades. At first, they'd been told the so-called experiment was only going to last for 6 months. Instead, it was 40 years, and through most of it, there was a known cure for the disease that they didn't even tell the men that they had. It's unbelievable, but it happened. Project 4.1 was tied to the US nuclear testing in the Marshall Islands in the 50s. Basically, after World War II, the US wanted to test the power of nuclear bombs, so they decided to detonate a bunch of them in the Pacific. The U.S. Atomic Energy Commission ran Project 4.1, which was supposed to monitor how the people living in the nearby areas were affected by radiation exposure. Again, no one bothered to tell them how dangerous this stuff was and that they were going to be exposed to massive amounts of radiation from the tests. It's really not that they didn't bother to, they actively avoided telling them. That's really what it was. They were left to suffer from cancer, birth defects, and all kinds of other diseases caused by the fallout. The US government didn't compensate the people for years, but eventually they did throw some money at them, as if that really helps. Many of the islands are still contaminated and people can't live on some of them. The US government basically sacrificed an entire population for the sake of military testing. After World War II, again, the US found itself in a bit of a dilemma. They wanted to get their hands on some of the best minds in Germany, specifically the scientists and engineers who worked on rockets and weapons. So instead of bringing them to trial for all the war crimes that had just happened, the government secretly brought them over to the States and gave them cushy new jobs as part of Operation Paperclip. They let scientists from the Third Reich off the hook for their involvement in horrible experiments just so the US could take advantage of their smarts. The most famous example is Werner von Braun, who'd helped develop Yahtzee Germany's rocket program. He was brought over to help the US space program, eventually leading to the Apollo moon landing. But it wasn't just rocket scientists. Some of these men had been involved in experiments on humans, including the use of concentration camp prisoners for medical tests. The US government knew this, but to them, winning the Cold War with the Soviets was more important than holding war criminals accountable. In the 1950s, the US Army decided to test biological weapons by spraying bacteria over San Francisco. They literally released bacteria into the air to see how a city might react to a biological attack. The bacteria they used, Bacillus globigii. You know what, anything you can't pronounce is just not good, right? You don't want it in your food, you certainly don't want it in the air. It's just like the things that you can pronounce are just typically better for you. It's like on food packages, where it just lists all these messed up names. Just don't eat that stuff. Anyway, it was supposed to be harmless in small doses, but they didn't tell the people of San Francisco, once again, that they were being experimented on. The army wanted to see how easily a biological agent could spread, and the residents of San Francisco were basically used as test subjects. I mean, they were. While the bacteria wasn't supposed to be harmful, it ended up getting people sick, and some even died. The military kept the whole thing secret for years, and when it eventually did come out, the public was, of course, furious. The army had put thousands of people's health at risk just to test the potential effects of a biological weapon.
What if watching violence actually teaches violence? In the 1960s, psychologist Albert Bandura set up a now famous experiment. Young people watched an adult beat up an inflatable clown doll, punching it, kicking it, even sometimes using weapons. When the kids were later left alone with the doll, they mimicked the exact same behaviors. The takeaway? Children don't just observe violence, they would replicate it. Bandura's work shaped how we think about media and aggression, but even he expressed concern that the experiment may have introduced violent behavior to people who otherwise wouldn't have shown it. The unsettling part? Modern studies suggest similar patterns with violent video games and real-world aggression. This one is as brutal as it sounds. In the 1970s, psychologist Harry Harlow, famous for his work on maternal bonding in monkeys, wanted to study depression. So he created a device he literally called the Pit of Despair, a small, dark isolation chamber. Baby monkeys were placed inside for weeks with no social contact. The result? Severe emotional trauma, self-harm, and in many cases irreversible psychological damage. Harlow admitted the experiment was intentionally cruel. He wanted to mimic the hopelessness of human depression, but critics say it crossed a line into pure torment. Even today, the study sparks fierce ethical debates, and it's one that science has never really justified. What if you could make enemies from nothing? In 1954, psychologists took 2 groups of boys to a summer camp without telling them that it was an experiment. The boys were separated into 2 groups and subtly encouraged to compete. Soon, they were insulting each other, vandalizing property, and even engaging in physical fights. The researchers had sparked a full-blown war. But then, they did something else. They introduced challenges that required both groups to cooperate. Slowly, the boys reconciled. The study showed how easy it is to manipulate people into conflict and how hard that is to undo. But many people criticized the deception involved and the emotional harm done, some of whom reportedly left the camp distraught. What if you could transmit thoughts into someone else's mind without ever speaking a word? In the 1970s, researchers tried to test telepathy under controlled conditions using what's known as the Ganzfeld technique. One person sat in a room with ping pong balls over their eyes, red light shining, and white noise playing. Meanwhile, a second person was shown an image and asked to send it mentally. The receiver described what they saw in their mind. Some trials showed above chance success, sparking decades of controversy. Critics say it's flawed science, but believers point to results that remain unexplained to this day. Even the original researchers backed away from the experiment, unsure if they'd uncovered real psychic ability or if they just tapped into coincidence. I don't know, I want to see what it's like with 2 people who don't know each other, 2 people who are like maybe in a relationship, and then twins. Twins got something crazy going on. I don't know. There's just that twin bond. I feel like twins can read each other's mind and they're just not telling the rest of us. This is not a conspiracy theory, it is actually in declassified files. In the 1950s and 60s, the CIA launched Project MKUltra, a top secret operation to test mind control, brainwashing, and interrogation methods. Unwitting citizens were dosed with an illicit substance without their consent. In one case, a man named Frank Olson was dosed and began having severe psychological distress and then died under suspicious circumstances days later. The CIA claimed it was self-inflicted. The experiments were done in hospitals, universities, even brothels, anywhere agents could manipulate people under the radar. When it finally came to light in the 1970s, the public was, of course, outraged. To this day, many documents remain missing, and even the scientists involved later admitted they never fully understood what they were playing with. Imagine volunteering for a simple psychology experiment, and then walking out barely able to function. In the 1950s, researchers at McGill University here in Canada paid students to lie alone in a soundproof, pitch-black room for extended periods. No clocks, no sound, no movement. What started as a study on sensory deprivation quickly spiraled. Volunteers began hallucinating vividly, seeing dogs, fire, and floating objects. Some became panicked, disoriented, or even paranoid. After only a few days, nearly every participant begged to leave. One later said, quote, "I started to feel like I was disappearing." The experiment was so psychologically damaging that McGill halted it, but not before the CIA took notes for their own purposes. What if you pretended to be insane just to see if doctors could tell? In 1973, psychologist David Rosenhan and 7 volunteers feigned auditory hallucinations to get admitted to psychiatric hospitals. Once inside, they acted completely normal. The shocking part? None of the hospital staff realized that they were faking. They were diagnosed with schizophrenia and kept locked up for weeks. One volunteer noted that, quote, "No one ever looked at us as people." Rosenhan's findings shattered public trust in psychiatric institutions, and after the experiment, hospitals became more cautious, but the psychological world never fully recovered from the embarrassment. Would you electrocute a stranger just because someone told you to? In 1961, Yale psychologist Stanley Milgram wanted to find out. Volunteers were told they were participating in a learning experiment. They were instructed to deliver electric shocks to another person, who was secretly an actor, every time they gave a wrong answer. The shocks weren't real, but the participants didn't know that. As the shocks supposedly increased, the actor began screaming and begging to stop, yet most people kept pressing the button. Why? because the authority figure told them to. Milgram was shocked, no pun intended, by how easily people could be manipulated into cruelty. While the study revealed something terrifying about obedience, it also left many participants traumatized. I mean, fair enough. What happens when your senses are taken away but you're fully awake? This psychological torture method, sometimes replicated in controlled research, involves placing a person in a completely white room. White walls, white clothes, white food, no noise, no color, no variation. While it's not always part of formal experiments, similar setups have been simulated in psychological studies to explore sensory control and breakdown. Subjects often report losing track of time, experiencing hallucinations, and in some cases, disassociating completely. Researchers who tested the concept on themselves described it as, quote, mental suffocation, and many admitted it was something they'd never willingly repeat. Can losing sleep actually drive you insane? Or even worse? In the 1950s, Russian researchers allegedly conducted an experiment where political prisoners were kept awake for 15 days using a stimulant gas. At first, the subjects appeared normal, chatting and joking, but as the days went on, things took a dark turn. They began whispering to themselves, talking to unseen entities, and eventually screaming for hours. By the end, one subject had reportedly torn apart his own flesh, while another was found lifeless. The story, known as the Russian sleep experiment, is controversial. Part urban legend, part rooted in actual Cold War psychological testing. Even if the details are exaggerated, real sleep deprivation studies from the same era showed terrifying results: paranoia, hallucinations, and in extreme cases, death.
Back in the 70s, a Russian physicist named Nikolai Kozyrev started talking about time in a very weird way. He theorized that it was something you could tap into, almost like energy. He believed time had physical properties, that it could be detected directly, which sounds pretty insane, but Kozyrev was a respected astrophysicist, and he did experiments using spinning gyroscopes, pendulums, and these mirrored chambers, now known as Kozyrev mirrors. These were large spiraled aluminum tubes that people would sit inside, and some of them said they had these out-of-body experiences and visions. The KGB supposedly took interest in his work too. The story goes they backed secret studies using these mirrors for everything from psychic research to remote viewing. Some Soviet cosmonauts were even said to have used Kozyrev mirrors in orbit to gather non-local information, which is a fancy way of saying they were trying to see or sense stuff from far away. Pretty bizarre. If you had a shortwave radio in the 70s or 80s, you might have heard a weird tapping sound, like a woodpecker. It may have come from the Duga radar, a massive radar system coming out of the Soviet Union. The thing was so loud and constant that radio operators around the world dubbed it the Russian woodpecker. Officially, Duga was part of a warning system for detecting incoming nuclear missiles, but unofficially, that's where things get strange. Some researchers believe the Soviets were doing more than just listening for nukes. There were rumors that Duga was part of a weather control experiment, or maybe even a Soviet mind control experiment. The theory was that the radar was manipulating the ionosphere, which is the layer of Earth's atmosphere that reflects radio waves. The Duga site is now abandoned, but to this day, no one outside the Russian military fully knows what Duga was really doing. In the Cold War, the US Navy built a massive communication system using extremely low frequency radio waves to communicate with submarines deep underwater. The original plan, Project Sanguine, proposed burying thousands of miles of cables across Wisconsin to send messages even if nukes hit the power grid. That version got scrapped because there were a lot of people protesting the environmental impact, so a scaled down system called Project ELF was launched. It operated from 1989 to 2004. Extremely low frequency radio waves, or ELF waves, could reach submarines hundreds of meters underwater. Officially, these waves only sent coded 2-letter messages and couldn't carry voice or data, but around the facilities, weird rumors started to spread. Some locals said animals would get spooked and people would feel suddenly woozy. And there were conspiracy theories about how ELF waves were distorting time, messing with the human mind. Since the early 2000s, governments like the US and China have been pouring money into quantum computing. Instead of using bits like a normal computer, which are either a 0 or a 1, these machines use something called qubits. Qubits can act like both 0 and 1 at the same time, which means quantum computers can run through insane numbers of calculations all at once. This is possible because of quantum physics, specifically superposition and entanglement. The goal is to use this to break encrypted codes and solve problems that would take a normal computer millions of years. But a lot of the experiments going on right now aren't public. Agencies like DARPA, NSA, and China's Ministry of State Security are racing to be the first to get a working, large-scale quantum computer. That kind of machine would give whoever builds it a massive advantage, especially when it comes to spying and warfare. NASA's EagleWorks lab tested a propulsion device called the EM drive that claimed to generate thrust without any fuel. The idea was to bounce microwaves around in a sealed metal chamber and somehow push forward. No exhaust needed. Well, in 2016, the team said they measured a tiny bit of thrust. It was about 1.2 millinewtons for every kilowatt of power, which is super small, but still a big deal if it was real, because it looked like the engine was pushing forward without anything pushing back. That would break one of the basic rules of physics, Newton's third law. But a lot of other scientists weren't really convinced. They thought the result might have just been a fluke, like a heat or a vibration messing with the sensors. Enter the Dresden University team. They built a much more sensitive test rig to measure the thrust and found that the tiny push NASA saw just might have been the device heating up and tilting ever so slightly. So yeah, it was exciting at first because it looked like a fuel-free engine could exist, but probably doesn't, at least not yet. Back in the early 2000s, Chinese military researchers started working on a new kind of torpedo that didn't move through water, it moved inside a bubble. This thing's called a supercavitating torpedo. The idea is that once it gets going fast enough, it creates a gas bubble around itself so it's not touching water at all. That means almost no drag. Ideally, you could have speeds of up to 230 miles per hour underwater. They were reportedly working on ways to steer it too, and if they pulled it off, it would break the physics of underwater combat. Normally, sound moves way faster than objects in water, but this thing could close the gap before anyone even detects it. And the Philadelphia experiment. It's been talked about in conspiracy circles for decades. As the story goes, in 1943, the US Navy supposedly tried to make the destroyer, USS Eldridge, visible to radar and ended up making it vanish from sight altogether. Some versions even say it teleported from Philadelphia to Norfolk, Virginia in the blink of an eye. The experiment allegedly used intense electromagnetic fields to bend light and warp space-time, basically trying to create a cloaking device way before anyone else ever dreamed of it. Supposedly things got really scary. Crew members reportedly got fused into the ship's metal, others went insane, and some were just never seen again. The story first came about in the 50s when a guy named Carl Allen sent letters claiming he had insider info on the incident. The Navy's always denied the whole thing, of course. Official records don't show any such experiment. But, like always, what do you guys think? Ross Island sits in the Bay of Bengal, just off the coast of India. Back in the 1800s, the British turned it into a prison colony for Indian rebels. They forced prisoners to clear the land and build government buildings, churches, and a fancy British clubhouse. And around the 1870s, doctors started using the inmates for medical experiments, mainly testing out treatments for malaria. They gave people large doses of medication, but the side effects were brutal. There were stories that some of the prisoners were so sick and desperate, there were cases of them doing awful things just so they could be executed. Things got that bad. The island was still active during World War II until a massive earthquake hit in 1941. Then the Japanese invaded and the British abandoned the place. After the war, it was left to rot. Now it's completely overgrown. Jungle has taken back almost everything. It's open to tourists, but nobody lives there anymore. Skrundel 1 was a Soviet secret town in Latvia built during the Cold War to support a massive radar station used for early warning against missile attacks. It wasn't on any maps, and unless you had military clearance, you were not getting in. The radar setup was part of a system that tracked launches across Europe. Soldiers, radar operators, and their families lived here. There were around 5,000 people at one point. Once Latvia regained independence in 1991, Russia kept operating the site for a few more years until the deal ran out in 1998. When they left, they didn't take much with them. They blew up one of the radar towers and walked away. The rest of the town was just abandoned. Today the place is a proper ghost town. Windows are busted out, classrooms are empty, the old apartment blocks are covered in moss and graffiti. It's popular with urban explorers, but officially it's closed to the public. Latvia tried auctioning off the land a few times, but nothing stuck. In 1928, Henry Ford bought a huge piece of land in the Amazon rainforest and decided to build his own town. He called it Fordlandia. I am not kidding. The plan was to grow rubber for his car factories, but instead of just planting trees, he built a full American-style town. There were white picket fences, a movie theater, golf course, a church. It looked like something straight out of Michigan, but dropped into the middle of the jungle. Very odd. The problem was Ford also had no clue how to grow rubber in the Amazon, and he didn't ask anyone who could. He planted the trees too close together, they got wiped out by fungus and bugs. On top of that, he enforced all these weird rules on people, like they had to dress a certain way, i.e. good old-fashioned American. There was no dancing allowed, definitely no unions. The workers had enough, and eventually they rioted. By 1934, the whole thing had basically fallen apart, and the place was left behind. In the end, it cost him millions, and the rubber output was almost nothing. Pyramiden was a Soviet mining town on a remote Arctic island in Norway. The Soviets bought it from Sweden in 1927. They built a full town from scratch here, with a school, hospital, gym, greenhouse, a music hall. By the 70s, about 1,000 people lived there. It had a hospital, a school, indoor pool, a Lenin statue. Not John, Vladimir Lenin. But in 1998, the mining company shut everything down. One day the workers left and they never came back. The buildings were just left as is. Books still sit on library shelves. Children's toys are scattered across classroom floors. There's a cafeteria where the plates and trays were never cleared. Russia still technically owns the land, and today there's a tiny skeleton crew that stays in the summer to maintain things. They do guided tours here, but it's not a functioning town anymore. In the 50s and 60s, Fort Detrick in Maryland was ground zero for two of the US government's creepiest science projects. From 1943 onward, the Army's biological warfare labs experimented with anthrax, botulism, Ebola, the list goes on. Then the CIA launched MKUltra here, a secret mind control program that dosed people with LSD, electroshock, sensory deprivation, and hypnosis, sometimes all at once. The goal is to force confessions or turn people into double agents. From 1954 to 1973, Fort Detrick also ran Operation Whitecoat, a biodefense research program where volunteers who were mostly conscientious objectors agreed to get exposed to things like rabbit fever and Q fever to help develop vaccines. It didn't involve kidnapping or LSD, but some volunteers went on to develop pretty severe health issues later on. Head out to the tip of Long Island and you'll find Camp Hero, a big radar station built in 1942 and active until 1982. Today it's a park, but there's a spooky legend attached to the place, the Montauk Project. According to Preston Nichols, who was a former engineer who wrote about it, the government was running secret experiments under the base starting in the late 60s, and they were pretty strange. He claimed there were underground labs with a device called the Montauk Chair that boosted psychic abilities, and that there were tests involving time travel, mind control, and portals to other dimensions. There are also conspiracies about youngsters having been kidnapped for these experiments. Obviously, Camp Hero became a big inspiration for Stranger Things.